I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Does the government have the constitutional power to suspend church services? How about socially distanced prayer outside of abortion clinics? What do Christians need to know about their rights during a national crisis such as the coronavirus pandemic? Today on the BreakPoint podcast, Alliance Defending Freedom Senior Vice President Kristen Waggoner joins John Stonetreet to answer these questions and more. Waggoner is one of America's leading attorneys on religious freedom, and you may recall that she successfully represented Masterpiece Cakeshop owner Jack Phillips before the Supreme Court. Here's John Stonetreet with our BreakPoint podcast guest, Kristen Waggoner.
Well, welcome to the BreakPoint podcast. We have gotten so many questions, and we have asked so many questions within the Colson Center about this unique time in history and how it might relate to religious freedom. So last week, we kind of all saw a headline in America, which we didn't expect to see in our lifetime, and we certainly didn't expect that maybe this would be the thing that would set off such a headline, where a Florida megachurch pastor decided to hold services in opposition to the suggestions of the state of Florida and was arrested. So here we have a headline, pastor arrested. And we've got so many different parts of this. Number one, the wisdom of a decision like this pastor made. And then also, what sort of opportunism does this provide to the state, and this continual dance between where the state stops and the civil society, in particular citizens and religious institutions, begin. It's been a dance that our country has had for a really long time, and at times like these, the precariousness of it and the significance of religious freedom becomes more obvious than ever. So I asked my good friend, Kristen Waggoner, who is the Vice President of the U.S. Legal Division and Communications with the Alliance Defending Freedom, one of our closest allies on all kinds of issues related to religious freedom, to join us today for a conversation. And like me, she is doing this out of her living room, although you can't hear this because you're just going to be listening to this on the podcast. But I'm looking at Kristen, and she's so dressed up for this that she's bringing an air of professionalism here that I really appreciate. Kristen, it's great to have you back on the BreakPoint podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
So listen, if we're getting all of these questions and wrestling with this on our level, this is obviously what ADF is about. You guys have been the attorneys for some of the most significant religious freedom cases of our lifetime. I would say the most significant religious freedom cases of our lifetime, including the Supreme Court, and actually a couple cases, pending right now at the Supreme Court. Certainly, we've talked an awful lot about Jack Phillips and the Masterpiece Cakeshop. You were his attorney, are his attorney. I can't imagine how many questions you're getting on kind of why are we seeing these headlines? What does this mean for religious freedom? Does the government have a right to tell churches to shut down? What should we be looking for? Are you guys getting a lot of phone calls and emails about this too?
Oh, yes. We're getting nearly 100 every day. People asking. We have a Church and Ministry Alliance that has about 2,000 members. And so those members are calling and emailing us, seeking assistance. And then just general calls from the public of people saying, what about our rights to free speech? Whether you're a pro-lifer, whether you're a religious organization that wants to be out in the public square or holding services. There are just a ton of people that are trying to figure out what are our rights here. And one of the issues is that it's not just states who are issuing these orders or the CDC issuing guidelines, but local government authorities. So we have to take each one of these on a case-by-case basis to analyze it.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to distinguish is between what is wise and good for churches to do. This isn't a conversation about whether a church should shut down. I'm on record as saying, look, even though we find ourselves in contention with the state on a number of issues, and we have in particular over the last decade or so, that doesn't mean we'll never agree with the state. And when the state says something, it might actually be wisdom. This is what's called spoiling the Egyptians, that sometimes those outside of the people of God come up with pretty good ideas too. And the gifts of medicine and the gifts of wisdom, knowing these things, and this could be an act of love. But that's a different sort of conversation than what sort of elbow room is the state creating for itself at a time like this. And even that differs from one county to another, one community to another. So first of all, give us kind of the lay of the land. How do we even start thinking about this well?
Well, in terms of the constitutional framework, our First Amendment rights cannot be permanently suspended. They just can't. The government doesn't have that kind of power to do that. And even during a time of a national crisis, there are constitutional tests that the courts have to apply that protect our rights. And officials should be recognizing that especially in times of crisis, the role that religion plays, the role that clergy members play in helping the nation navigate that crisis is essential. One of the neat things about what's happened in the last few weeks is if you go to one of the government websites, the federal government website, it says that clergy members that are working with individuals are essential in this COVID crisis, and states should be paying attention to that. I think that in terms of the constitutional test, what we would look at is, does the state have a compelling interest to burden religion, to stop us from meeting, from stopping us from going to our Bible studies? And a compelling interest just means something really important, something of the highest order is what the court refers to it as. But there's another really key part to this test, which is the state trying to achieve this really important interest in the most narrow way possible? Meaning they can't burden more of our First Amendment freedoms than are necessary. And so that's where you get into that case-by-case analysis. It can vary from state to state, from county to county. And we know that as a part of that, the orders have to be temporary in nature because no government official has the power to permanently close a church, and that there needs to be consistency in how they're applying it. We can get into that as well if you'd like.
Yeah, we need to get into that. And I do want to say that we're often accused when it comes to things like this of being easily triggered, to which I reply, well, yeah. And there's a reason, right? I mean, we all remember, I'm old enough to remember when the government was trying to make nuns purchase birth control, right? I mean, this doesn't take too much of a memory to realize that the government's definition of kind of a compelling interest was very invasive on our ability to order our public lives in particular, but even at times, maybe even our private institutions around our deeply held convictions. Like, in other words, we're easily triggered because it's there. And then in the midst of all this, when we have a headline in Florida and so on, you have something like Mayor de Blasio's comments when he's actually threatening to permanently shut down churches. Now, part of us wants to go, well, that's a stupid thing for him to say because he actually literally could not do that, right? Even in New York City, you could not do that. But it tells you a lot about what he believes.
Well, that one got to me. I actually read
I was triggered. I admit, I was a triggered one, and so was Kristen.
I was triggered.
Yeah, there we go.
I was, yeah. So the New York Daily News published an op-ed that I wrote last week on it that really just tried to emphasize the right of free exercise is not a right of convenience or luxury. One of the issues here is that Mayor de Blasio has been so hostile to religious freedom that it's hard to apply a presumption of good faith, looking at his track record. And yet, I hope that we can do that in hoping that maybe that statement was careless exaggeration. But if it wasn't, we will sue and we will win. Because that kind of absolute hostility and really religious bigotry violates the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, and then we had headlines in, what was it, the Washington Post and some other places blaming the conservative Christians in particular for how bad this has gotten. Again, just kind of a crazy sort of thing. All right. Well, let's go back then to those two constitutional tests that you gave, and let's look then at these stay-at-home orders. It would seem to me, looking at this, outside of these comments, just the decision itself, that there is a compelling interest, that there's really no other way to accomplish the spread or the curbing, the downward curve of this disease, other than people just can't gather. But if they're saying that to people of faith, but not to movie theaters and not to sporting events, then that would be inconsistent. All right. So are you looking at this saying, okay, at least in their deeds, not appropriating Mayor de Blasio and the rest of every other governor or mayor in America. Are we passing this test right now, or do you still have some red flags?
Oh, we still have red flags. We're writing letters to government officials. I think there are really 4 criteria that we're looking at. One is the order vague? Is it unclear? There's a requirement that if you're going to be infringing on First Amendment rights, you need to be clear in what the limits are. And that has been a massive problem across the United States. We can talk about examples of that. Second is it temporary in nature? And there are some problems with that. Virginia's recent order is an example of that. Is it consistent? And that's based on ADF, by God's grace, was able to prevail in a decision called Trinity Lutheran before the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said in that case that it's odious under the Constitution to target religious organizations or to treat them differently than you would similar organizations. If you're going to offer a generally available public benefit, then you can't exclude people of faith just because they're religious or religious organizations. The last one is the means of enforcement. So, we've seen some orders come out with some pretty draconian measures or penalties. On the one hand, you have people saying, well, I think we should let criminals out of jail so that they don't contact corona. And those same officials seem to be saying, and I think we should put pastors in jail so they can't hold their religious services. So we've got to make sure that the means of enforcement line up with the current situation. And there are lots of examples for all four of those different criteria where government officials have gone awry.
Yeah, I mean, do you kind of attribute all of those to kind of bad faith? I mean, I can see that with folks like de Blasio, but I could also see a lot of people are just scrambling and trying to put together the best solution they can, and maybe just need some correction and some help on the backside.
You are so right. And that has been a bit of a silver lining for us in this. We have written letters to government officials or, called and corresponded with them and said, hey, this isn't clear. Or this is unconstitutional. And government officials, by and large, have been very quick to heed those concerns and to make adjustments. And we're telling those that are calling us, we want to act with the spirit of cooperation. There needs to be a spirit of cooperation on both sides and not a spirit of antagonism. That's not loving our neighbor, and it's not being a witness bearer of Christ, I think, in this season.
Well, and one of the things that we've talked about so often on BreakPoint is we put these things in the category of you'll miss us when we're gone, right? So this idea of treating religious faith and so on as a luxury as opposed to this is Christians living out their faith, right? And if you tell us you can't live out your faith in public, what that means is a whole lot of those people who always run into the hurricanes and are there ready to distribute FEMA aid to everybody who needs it. Do you want them not to live out their faith? Because that's what they're doing, like literally right now. And so the spirit of antagonism really misses what the USA Today article said, I think, during Hurricane Harvey, which is, if you got anything from FEMA, you probably got it from a Methodist, a Baptist, or something like that, because they're the ones actually doing this. And we're seeing the same thing, right? We're seeing the same thing with Samaritan's Purse, setting up a hospital with emergency rooms in New York City. We're seeing churches that are really doing stunning work. Increased testing in communities where it wouldn't be available in Alabama and Oklahoma and other places. And so this is really amazing stuff. And do you sense that government officials remember that sort of thing, or do they need to be reminded, or both?
I think it's probably both. I think that if you have an understanding of religious freedom and what it means to be a person of faith, then you don't need to be reminded of that. But there are many government officials and those in our communities who really don't have a sense of what it is to be guided by a church, to need to attend church, to be able to be motivated by your faith, to love your neighbor. And gentle reminders can be helpful. I think the vast majority of Americans don't really care if the person that's giving them medical aid agrees with their views on a particular social issue or economic issue. It's only activists that are speaking out and caring about those things. And I think that it demonstrates they're not looking at what really is motivating and pursuing the common good. It's actually harmful in the end to have that kind of polarizing view.
I hope you're enjoying John Stonetreet's interview with ADF Senior Vice President Kristen Waggoner. I mentioned that Waggoner defended Jack Phillips before the U.S. Supreme Court, but did you know that she's also a graduate and a huge fan of our Colson Fellows program? She, along with over 1,000 people from all walks of life, government leaders, small business owners, big business owners, educators, you name it, have been equipped to live out their faith in their sphere of influence, reshaping the world in light of God's kingdom. The Colson Fellows program is accepting applicants for its next class right now. Please come to colsonfellows.org to learn more and to apply. That's colsonfellows.org. Now let's get back to John Stonetreet and Kristen Waggoner.
One of the things I want to point out here as we're having this conversation, and again, my guest today is Kristen Waggoner, is the Vice President of the U.S. Legal Division and Communications with the Alliance Defending Freedom. And we're just talking about kind of the red flags that a lot of Christians have right now when it comes to religious freedom and, freedom of assembly and things like that in the wake of the coronavirus. I know your job, Kristen, is to often defend the religious freedom of those who don't necessarily see eye to eye, with either your deeply held Christian convictions or how you would do it or whatever. So I can say maybe a little bit more freely that I look at some of these high profile stories and say, look, this isn't wise, right? With this, for example, the choice to continue to meet isn't not wise. I mean, follow certain protocols or whatever, but it's just, we saw it in South Korea. We've seen it in other places. There's a way to love your neighbor. There's a Christian history to this. We covered this on BreakPoint just recently, that this is the Spanish flu. In 1600, a Puritan, Richard Baxter, said, we're going to follow the magistrate's order. It's a way of, loving God and recognizing that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And these are all kind of theological and cultural things. But here's what I want to say. I have been also very pleased that the number of stories of bad actors or what I would consider unwise actions have been so few. There are thousands of churches in America. I was talking with Aaron Baer on a podcast for them recently, or a webcast. He runs the Ohio Family Policy Council. And he was talking about how he was paying attention, and that's his job, to pay attention to specifically what's happening in Ohio, but that there weren't any churches that weren't kind of flouting this. And I really have a problem when the media holds up, it's kind of the Westboro Baptist situation, right? You're holding up a bad actor as if this is norm. This is the way Christians are doing it these days. And that's just not the case. There's so few examples that I can see. Am I missing some, or would you agree with that assessment?
I would totally agree with that assessment. I mean, the calls that we're getting are not religious organizations saying, I'm going to demand to meet, will you represent me? That is not what's happening. They're calling and saying, I want to make sure we're complying with the law. This doesn't make sense to me. And how long should we be willing to go along with this? Like, what should we be doing? And frankly, many of the calls have been orders that have been so confusing that churches don't even know if they can bring people in to put the service online. And so they're very reasonable requests, and government officials have made some mistakes. They've been quick to accommodate and to make sure that their orders, to clarify their orders. And so in some ways, I've been encouraged by this. I don't know if you saw, John, but I think there was some sort of study that the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission came out with in the last week or so, or it might have, of course, I saw it on Twitter, so I don't know that I can verify the validity of it. That said something like, of all the churches that they surveyed, only 1%, less than 1%, I think, were even having services. And 10 states are allowing churches to have services right now, 10 states or so, where it's legal. So that was very encouraging as well.
Yeah, and I guess that's where the bad faith thing, leads some of us to be triggered, right? When somebody holds that up, like in the governor, like the mayor of New York City, as if that's a real problem in New York City, right? As if there are just churches everywhere that are threatening to disobey this stay-at-home order, and it's just not true. And there is this tendency to scapegoat religious people during times like this. I mean, we just see it historically. I think we see it in China, where Muslim Uyghurs are the ones that are the scapegoats of almost everything, and they didn't miss an opportunity to update. And I'm not comparing us to them. It's just if we're not paying attention to this, it actually matters. So give us a couple things that should raise red flags for us. Maybe kind of help equip everyday Christians that are watching this with concern. How do we not lose our minds? How do we have good faith with the people that we have to, work with in the state and even answer to in the state? Give us some advice. Help equip the average everyday Christian to be the right sort of citizen and pay attention to the right sorts of things.
I think first, what you've already touched on is when you're having texts or conversations with neighbors or family members about how the church is responding, get the word out. Share that a lot of the churches they're abiding by these orders. They've moved to a mobile ministry mindset rapidly, which is just so cool that the church on a dime is making those adjustments so well. And the good news of all the things that churches are doing that you've talked about, whether it's providing food and services, opening up their parking lots to be centers for COVID testing, having drive-through churches. I've heard of, our pastors, for example, they've called everyone in the church that's, 60 years or older, and then they're going to start moving their way back down the decades as well. I mean, so there's so many ways that the church is meeting the needs, even, like Samaritan's Purse, like you talked about, and, Convoy of Hope, and all these different organizations that are stepping up so that the church can be the church. We're not a building, emphasizing that. I think in terms of trying to figure out what do we do from here, or concerns, red flags that we have about religious freedom, maybe some examples would be helpful of things to watch out for or that we've seen. One was in Washington State, where the governor suggested you couldn't have online services. Writing a letter, we wrote a letter and they fixed that. But those types of things that are prohibiting online services. There was the Maryland pastor story. I don't know if you saw about the pastor that thought he was abiding by the order because he had 9 people and they were socially distancing. Again, that was an instance of a vague order. It just wasn't clear what you could do. So seeking clarification can be helpful in those instances. And then I think, we represent a group from Greensboro, North Carolina, that was arrested for doing a prayer walk outside of an abortion clinic. In that case, that matter is going on right now. Understanding what your rights are in this season, that it's okay to pray, and we should be constantly vigilant about praying, but that there also may be some things that you can do outside that is compliant with the orders and that still is protecting the health and safety of others. So I think understanding what your rights are and how these things apply can be really helpful.
Can you share any more details about the Greensboro story? Just because Justin Reeder is a friend, the organization's Love Life Charlotte. I've been following this a little bit on social media. I've been meaning to reach out to him this week, and I just haven't. But I have been following this. We have some very close connections with them. In fact, my wife and I were on a cruise not that long ago. In fact, not that long ago, too close to comfort, not that long ago, with Justin and his wife. They're just a wonderful couple doing amazing work there. What can you share about the Love Life story there in Greensboro?
Well, the facts are still unfolding, and we're working on that case. We've sent a letter to the city officials, and we will likely follow up with a lawsuit if the situation is not rectified. Essentially, the group prayer walks are permitted. You can pray outside and you can walk. And they, as far as we understand it, there's a video that suggests they were applying social distancing, were within the law, and the city attorney was basically suggesting, he actually said you could ban all First Amendment activity. And that's just not true. So we're doing the best we can to get the city to see the right point of view in this without filing the lawsuit. But individuals were arrested as they were praying and offering some counseling outside of an abortion clinic.
I think that's one of the things that has us triggered as well. Which is that we continue to see Planned Parenthood, flaunt directives in cities, in states like Louisiana, Texas, and other places where they've been told to shut down. We've seen judges kind of put some of these laws on hold. We have, Planned Parenthood and other states basically closing down all their services except for abortion services, where they make a lot of money. And of course, we have governors of progressive governors of states, I'll put it that way to be more precise, basically deeming this essential services while pregnancy care centers are non-essential. This seems to be a real area of concern.
Oh, it definitely is. It's an area of high concern for us. And just last night, I was editing a brief that we're prepared to file today in one of these cases. There are cases going on in Texas and in Oklahoma about whether abortion is considered an essential service. And as a part of that, it's essentially the abortion distortion. You know that. It comes out in all different areas of the law. But while everyone is compromising in so many different areas to have this spirit of cooperation, Planned Parenthood is asking for a special exemption so that they can continue to fill their coffers. And that is what this is about. It's about the business and the money side of things. And of course, they're wanting to shut down anyone who would offer sidewalk counseling consistent with orders and consistent with social distancing outside, so that they can continue to take the lives of unborn children and pad their bottom line.
and they want to be considered a small business for the sake of the Small Business Association loans, even though when it's convenient, they're not a business. But we could harp on this, for forever, and maybe it needs to. But that's also an area of concern that we've been kind of talking about and writing about, and will continue to. Well, look, I'm grateful, Kristen, for the time today. These are hard times, and one of the things you and I said offline is that I don't know if that they're unprecedented times, but they're unprecedented times in our context. And we're coming out of, again, years in which the federal government has wanted to force nuns to buy contraception, and where state governments have really overstepped, and even civil, very localized governments, like in the case of Jack Phillips, unelected, civil rights commissions that are trying to step on private business owners. So the idea that we're concerned about this, I think, is a very, very legitimate concern, and that we can be concerned and still love our neighbor at the same time. We can be concerned about the health and safety and well-being of our congregation and about the religious freedom at the same time. And I don't see any other way through this without thinking that we can walk and chew gum at the same time on this one. We've got to be able to do both.
Absolutely. Again, it's about having a spirit of cooperation. I think it's about not having an antagonistic spirit and being vigilant to protect our liberties. But part of loving God means loving our neighbor. And we have to recognize that this is a unique time, but it's temporary in nature. So we just need to continue to protect freedom. And when we see them cross the line, with kindness, with a gentle spirit, say, hey, you're crossing the line, you need to fix it. And then if they don't, as lawyers, we come in and do our best to help them fix it.
Well, you guys do such a great job. We're obviously huge fans and friends, and love the work of ADF and have for so long. Point people online. Is there any place where you're kind of collecting these stories and collecting these concerns so that people can go and just kind of stay informed and review them?
Well, we are providing resources on our website at adflegal.org. I don't know that we're necessarily we're not posting the spreadsheet that our team has, and they do have a large spreadsheet of the different situations, but we are posting resources and posting stories about ways you can help, including we're going to be working on posting ways to help some of our clients like Jack Phillips, Baronell Stutzman, Blaine Adamson. They are really suffering in these times, as so many other small business owners are. And just one last shout out, I would hope and ask your listeners to pray for Jack Phillips. He has a hearing right there in Colorado this week, April 9th, for the third lawsuit that's been filed against him. Pray that the court dismisses that lawsuit and that he can continue to operate his business consistent with his faith, as he's trying to just keep it open right now in this time of COVID.
Well, my guest today has been Kristen Waggoner, Senior Vice President of U.S. Legal Division and Communications with the Alliance Defending Freedom. And if you come to BreakPoint.org, we will link you to ADF and ADFlegal.org, as well as some of the different stories that we've covered on BreakPoint and some of the articles and things from Kristen and her team. Kristen, thanks so much for taking the time to kind of update us on this. I mean, you kind of think everyone's shut down, and you guys are clearly not shut down, maybe even more busy than you thought you would be. Anyway, I'm just grateful for this update.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to get to partner with Colson Center, and we love the stuff that your group's putting out. And education and cultivating a biblical worldview in the church is the key to moving forward for the next generation.
Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint podcast. As John mentioned, come to breakpoint.org for more on Alliance Defending Freedom. And please remember to come to colsonfellows.org to learn more about our life and faith-changing program. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.